Okay, I will tie together Professor Chamanlal's and Aparna Vaidik's presentations today. And I would also summarize the basic arguments of these two presentations. Professor Charu Gupta's argument, while looking at proscription, trod a slightly different path. So I will sum up her argument on a different level. So both Professor Chamanlal and Dr. Vaidik looked at the nature of the state, and I was reminded very much of the way in which the colonial state built in within its liberal structure a constant state of exception, which made coercion, excessive coercion, be in the sidelines with any kind of public questioning of its legitimacy. The coercion could be trotted out as the excess, the governmental excess which could be let loose. And both the speakers brilliantly brought up their observations to the contemporary Indian scenario, where law and the state does have a very important, and I think also a rather scary similarity in operating at this level with the state of exception. Professor Chamanlal brought in the emergency powers of the Press Act of 1922, very, very precisely following a series of disaffection and trials, which Aparna Vaidik actually highlighted as this coming together of the sedition, conspiracy, and the hidden power of the state getting released and making coercion a legitimate act, right? Okay. I also thought the most brilliant part of Dr. Vaidik's presentation to be the connection between the press and the writings of the revolutionaries who were combining violent activity, combining the tactics, the guerrilla tactics, sudden, unpredictable, taking the state by surprise, being peripatetic, and also obviously with intent to make themselves visible, but the extent to which they had spilled over into a public imagination remained unknown, right? Okay, so it was this combination which made conspiracy, coming from the Judaico-Christian tradition, brought into the colonial Indian legal vocabulary, and then being combined with the notion of sedition, which could bring action, which could bring state action in these very, very orchestrated trials. I really thought both the presentations were absolutely spot on and present to the colonial past. In fact, it's almost as if colonialism never went away. It's very much here with us. And Professor Charu Gupta's talk was actually again turning on certain kinds of proscriptions that had cultural overtones of understanding what was not legitimate, what was illicit, what was forced to be secret, but yet which constantly burst out in print, which had two ways of getting addressed. The first one, which was an outrage, both by the colonial state as well as by elite consent, wanted these to be censored. But at the same time, she shows how they could not be censored. They had a life of their own, and they constantly burst out of any kind of censorship, any kind of of attempting to hold them down, and they thrived on proscription. Actually, the more you banned these kinds of writings, the more they erupted elsewhere. She was. I also thought that her. In fact, I thought that was a very collective understanding, that there was an ethical and a kind of connectivity between the perceptions of hate and hate literature, perceptions of pleasure, the literature related to pleasure, sexuality, etc., women's sexuality, and how these are portrayed in a certain connected space, right, which shared certain kinds of similarities with the moral voices within the colonial state as well, within the ruling classes as well. Now, I have several questions. They're all wonderful presentations, but I have several questions. My first question goes to Charu. Okay, Charu. My question is, when you're looking at this proscribed literature, erupting out of the interstices of censorship, right? Okay, they cannot be held in. They are erupting from between the lines. Is there a kind of division within the more aesthetic perceptions? That's the upper caste, because this question came up also in the first half, in section 1, where more educated people are perhaps incapable of expressing in vulgar, in crude vocabulary, exactly what is sensual, or what is sexual, or what is hate. So is there a kind of a kind of class distinction, which there somehow seems to be in the Bengal case, where there is a clear distinction between the Bhadralok, Chotalok kind of division, right? Okay, so is there a tendency of passing the buck, as it were, that certain kinds of castes, upper castes or educated communities would not really indulge in such outrageously explicit literature that is celebrated or used literature, sexuality as titillating literature, and was it some kind of peculiar expression of a different kind of mentality, right? So histories of mentalities, histories of or understanding of location within educated groups, how would this pan out in the Hindi, Urdu, and vernaculars, the different kinds of public spheres in the vernaculars? That was also, I think, absolutely brilliant, where the vernaculars are far more ebullient in that way, far more expressive of subversive feelings. Upper castes would possibly call them perversions, but print also has its subversive moments. So that was my question to you, Charu. First, let Charu answer, and then my questions would go to the other two speakers, and then I will open the floor to the audience. Charu.
So thanks a lot, Anindita. That was such a brilliant summary and such perceptive comments. So, I would tend to argue that while there are these anxieties among upper caste, middle classes about, obscene literature, the thing is that, for them it is, they make these distinctions, false distinctions between erotica and obscenity, and it is fine for the elites, the cultured elites to read, for example, Kalidas's Kumar Sambhav, which is equally erotic, or to read other kinds of texts, and there it is perfectly acceptable. It is precisely because erotica is now reaching masses in this kind of distorted fashion, according to them, that it becomes a problem. But I think this is only one side of the story, and actually what you see is, well, I can't comment on Bengal so much, but I would say that there is actually this kind of distinction between elite presses and the, common presses, or between elite writers and common writers, and the kind of subjects that they take up actually on the ground is breaking down, precisely because of market forces, because there are these new kinds of ideas about companionship, about marriage, about relationships between men and women that are also coming into play. So, to take a classic example, somebody like Krishnakant Malviya, who on the one hand is writing communist literature, on the other hand, he's also becomes, at one point editor of Abhyuday, which takes out, material on Hindu kind of aggressive Hinduism, but he also writes books like, Prem, Manorma ke Patra apne premiyon ke naam, and one of these established writers and also an established press, brings out these kinds of books, which can be regarded, by someone else as quote unquote obscene. Or, for example, somebody like Santram BA, though he, he belongs to Shudra caste, but he, he translates Mary Stopes into Hindi, and and really widely publishes this, and constantly tries to say that these books are not obscene, but they are actually scientific. So what I'm saying is that the lines between elite and popular and those kind of were actually very blurred, and they impinged on each other in significant ways. So there were a lot of normative kind of ideologies which were infiltrating the so-called popular and mass print cultures, and so where, again, you have those kind of normative heterosexual ideals being actually strengthened. And similarly, there are these kind of processes where actually ideas which are considered obscene actually can be seen in some of the so-called elite publications as well. So I think the distinctions are really blurred, and they are much more on the ground. They are much more messy and inchoate, in the way they function.
Thank you very much. My question to Aparna, and I hope you don't mind me calling you Aparna, to Aparna and to Professor Chaman Lal, is a slightly different one. I would like to ask you that the indeterminacy of the disaffected, public, which is beginning to get familiarized with a certain kind of vocabulary of dissent, because I really like the distinction between what the colonial state was actually hitting out against the vocabulary, which is a political vocabulary. It is not necessarily just sedition. It's not, and it's just not, routine writing against the state. It's also the vocabulary of political imagination, which is replacing a flat vocabulary characterizing less politicized civil society, right? So we are, there is a fear of a increasing politicization of a civil society. Professor Chamanlal, of course, looked at the tightening up of structures, right? So a Press Act with emergency powers, 1922. I remember he said that very emphatically. But you too, Aparna, looked at the state not like the way Nurani or Chaudhary looks at the failed state, but as a state which which is releasing springs of different kinds of empowerment, right? The state of exception. I think that's a very important reservoir of power, which the state kind of keeps in a kind of backup, which is released in emergency, and that is, I think, for both the colonial state as well as for the colonized, the third space, right? There is not just the two spaces of the state. I mean, I'm commenting, but would you understand this as something which is, not a kind of binary division between the colonial state and the colonized, but the space of a completely hidden. You can see the tip of the iceberg, but you cannot gauge the depths to which a new kind of political vocabulary has actually penetrated. That might be the third space which the colonial state really has no grip over. So it is a state in fear, right? It's a colonial state in fear. But perhaps the understanding of its own, maybe it is not feeling powerless, maybe, but because it is panicking, because it is, releasing the power held in its reservoirs, right, in its backup system, does it not open the the path to failure, right? So once it feels not in control, once it feels that it has lost control of a situation, and it is releasing its reserved, its forces held in reserve, is it not also perhaps beginning to look at its fall, right? It is beginning to look at its loss of power, perhaps. We'll not call it a failed state, but loss of power, perhaps. So I do not think it's a confident government, right? If you look at Nicholas Dirks, or if you look at Agamben, a confident government will not actually release that reservoir of power, right? So I just wanted you to respond to that.
Shall I go for it?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Aparna,
So,
you can go ahead. Yeah.
okay. Thank you, Professor Chamlal. Okay. So, before I answer this directly, I just want to talk a little bit about my engagement with certain kinds of primary sources, and why I began thinking like this. And I'm like open to reviewing my ideas, because this is something I'm grappling with. So here is what I have been thinking. So you see, my earlier work is on history of Andaman Islands. Yeah, and I looked at about 100 years of records in it. Yeah, and nowhere would I ever find an agreement between what was happening in Whitehall, or what was happening in Calcutta, and what was happening in Andaman. Yeah, so I came up with this argument of, it's an old one debate, whether the state is in a process, it is constituted from, from bottom up, and how do we understand the state and all that. But its lack of agreement actually challenged the idea of the colonial mind. Yeah, and that a lot of the policy was actually being constituted on the ground, and then the paperwork was being engineered to generate agreement at different levels. So that's the sense I got, right? So I was like, I'm moving forward as a historian who doesn't look for agreement, who presumes disagreement and doesn't see the colonial state as one single whole. That there are heterogeneous elements and they may not add up, right? Now, with time, I drift away and I start working on the revolutionaries. And instead of 100 years, I start looking at 5 years of history or 10 years of history. And when I'm looking at the trial history, I'm looking at 2 years worth of history. And suddenly I start finding a lot of agreement. Yeah, between police, judiciary, like not only in the different, in the executive, judiciary, police and all that, but at different levels of the government. Yeah, so I'm like, okay, how do I understand this? Yeah. So what I'm coming up against is closing of ranks. Yeah. So then I start asking, when does the state close ranks? What happened for the state to close ranks? And I know you have articulated it as releasing the backup. Yeah, we can understand it and we can phrase it. We can associate we can use different kinds of metaphors to understand what the phenomenon. But the point is, whatever was happening was different from what was happening, what I saw in play when it came to Andaman. Yeah. So, and then I began to think of it as failure. And the historiography explains it as failure, right? So then I'm thinking that is it really failure, or is it, or does it show me the staying power of the state, its ability to close ranks when threatened, especially when the threat is by an armed native, and when the threat is a physical one. Yeah. So, and so I will not throw away the heterogeneous process understanding of the state and it being, being different at different levels. I'm not going to throw that away. So the argument, the larger argument that I started veering towards or creating in my mind was that the state generally functions in the manner that I saw it functioning in my earlier records. But on some days it closes ranks. So it is those other heterogeneous disagreements and lack of colonial mind kind of thing situation that prevails, which is interspersed with moments of closing the ranks. So the staying power of the state comes from both, aligning where it needs to align and then remaining and then creating spaces of negotiation where it allows itself to be negotiated by the native. So I don't know how much of whether this argument works. I would invite it reflections if anybody wants to say anything.
Well, I think you're absolutely right when you say that the state has two levels. One is the everyday level, and the other one is the emergency. Right? It's at the point which it identifies as crisis that it comes together. So it has these different levels of functioning, and I really thank you for that response. Yeah, it was really good. And Professor Chamanla, that was also I think a very illuminating talk, because both Professor Chamanlal's and Dr. Vedik's presentations were on similar lines. I will not address any specific question to Professor Chamanlal. We are running out of time, and the audience needs to now talk back to the speakers. Open to the audience, please.
Do you want me to speak? Or you want to invite more questions?
Yes. The audience will ask you, sir.
Okay.
Yeah. Please stay there, sir. Right. Can I ask the audience to participate? Divya Rai, please.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So my question is to Professor Charu Gupta. Ma'am, you talked about a push at the end of the indigenous elite towards proscription of certain kind of literature or writings that that particular section believed to be obscene or immoral. So during the colonial era, one of the genres that faced this to the maximum, I would say, was Rekhti, and generally the works that deal with Rekhti call for a term called eraser. Like today we're talking about proscription, but generally when we when we talk about Rekhti, we tend to use the term eraser of that particular genre. So I would like if you could reflect upon it. Like, do you think that there was this tendency of erasure towards literature that was supposedly believed to be obscene or immoral at the end of the indigenous elites? And how did this tendency of if there was this tendency of erasure, then how did it impact the production of that or proliferation of that literature?
So I agree with your argument partially. So there was, in terms of certain kinds of even oral narrative. So, for example, Kajri, which was largely an authorless kind of form of songs, which could be quite erotic at times, which was sung largely by low caste women. What happens in the colonial period is that because they move to print and largely men start authoring that there is an erasure of the kind of female authorless culture, and that kind of space vanishes. Or for example, in the case of Rekhti, Ruth Sunita's work is very good at that. There is a certain kind of what they've argued is that a minor homophobic voice, which is there, in the pre-colonial period, actually becomes much more vociferous and much more institutionalized and much more organized in the colonial period, leading to certain kinds of erasures, to certain kinds of or for example, Sumanta Banerjee's work also shows this, that how there is an erasure of certain kinds of spaces, literature, a kind or for example, the way in which Braj and Avadhi, for example, because Khadi Boli takes over as the dominant language of expression, and prose takes over poetry much more. We also see this kind of, in certain ways, let's not call it, I won't call it erasure, but at least a marginalization of this kind of space. But I would like to extend this. I would say I would not end here. While there is an erasure taking place, there are new kinds of spaces opening up. So, for example, there is an attack on Nautanki at this time. But what happens is, once the Nautanki starts getting printed, actually it's performance increases, because now more people, while one Nautanki is being performed by one group, once it's printed, there are others who are adopting it, or taking those on and reinterpreting it, or even bringing political elements into it, etc. Or for example, the example that so what. Or, for example, the way in which Kajri is now extended for political uses as well. Though there is a lament, of course, about that, because it takes away from the beauty and the kind of pleasures of Kajri. So what I'm saying is that, of course, there is an erasure of certain spaces, certain kinds of poetry, certain kinds of eroticism, certain kinds of pleasures. But there is, on the other hand, new ways and new avenues that also open up at this time. For example, this argument is often made that there's an erasure of, say, courtesan culture, but there is also a democratization of sex work at this time. They're getting much more organized. They're giving petitions to the government. They are increasing much more in numbers. They are getting they're much more they're voicing their demands. They're asking the right to work. So I think there are erasures, definitely, and this kind of proscriptions and censorships does lead to shrinking of certain spaces and certain kinds of literature, certain kinds of expressions. But I think there are new avenues opening up, and there is a recarving of that space, and that is also taking place. I don't know if you have answered your question or not, Divya.
Ma'am, I got my answer. Thank you so much.
Any other question? Ravi.
Okay. To Professor Chaman Lal, it's a wonderful panel. I enjoyed it. Thanks for all those papers. Thanks, Charu, for teasing out stuff for for our project, from your work. And thanks, Aparna and Professor Chaman Lal. I want to ask Professor Chaman Lal, how long did this journal Bhavishya, I've seen some of the files, carry on? Because I think Ramraj Singh Sehgal was in the jails more than he was out of it. And Bhavishya is a phenomenal journal. I mean, whatever files I have seen, it's at once progressive in our sense of the term. It's forefronting women. It's reporting on civil disobedience movement on a daily basis. It was a weekly, and it was pictorial, very illustrative. So I want to ask Professor Chaman Lal, we are going to use also that Punjabi thing that you mentioned. We want to showcase that, but Bhavishya, definitely. Please tell us, how long did it carry on? To Aparna Vedika, I kept thinking of Ranjit Guha, elementary aspects of peasant insurgency. Even though there is no print there, even though there is no public sphere of the kind that we are talking about when we are talking about print, but his move to invert the colonial way of framing the peasant, whatever the peasants did, and how it was framed as crime. So he inverts everything, right? Was it violence? No, it was not violence. There were lots of warnings given before they, indulge in violence or take recourse to. So this inversion, and there is a public message. So conspiracy comes from, I think, a traditional mode of looking at upturning existing regimes, right? So Marathas would do a conspiracy against everybody, as would others. So and Mughal Darbar is a hotbed of conspiracy all the time. One brother conspiring against the other. So it's religious, but also it's very much a way polity defined and conducted itself. So a residue of that is available in the way colonial law is framed. I think so. But Ranjit Guha, what he does is also useful for us in the way that rebels can be actually seen and their acts can be seen, because you are also trying to make that effort. I'm not getting into failure or success. That is, I think, both sides are tactically using each other's weaknesses as well as strengths and whatever forums they can provide to each other. And I also kept thinking of, Kakuri Kand, which has been renamed as Kakuri Action now. I mean, come on, I found it really funny. What should we do to, Ramcharitmanas and Ramayana, where we have Kands? Kands as chapters, Kands as Prakaran, and now we are saying, no, Kand is conspiracy. It's a colonial way of naming what was a glorious action, right? This is what the UP government seems to be suggesting to us. But how funny it is, the way names keep changing of these events over the years, in history and in public memory. Thanks a lot for a wonderful panel.
Any other questions?
Really, thank you for this. And I think I end up making the definition quite static, but this is a good reminder. Thank you for that.
Shall I say something in response to Ravi? Hello?
Yes, please, Professor Chamanlal, please speak.
Yeah, Ravi has asked about the Bhavishya's timeline. Actually, I have no definite idea of its timeline. I think Ramrak Singh Sehgal was earlier working with Pandit Sundarlal. In some of his journals, I am not this time remembering that journal. But then he started his own journal, and I think in 1920 or so. Interestingly, as you are telling that you have seen some files, but how I have a book, Krantivir Bhagat Singh, Abhyudaya or Bhavishya. Now, in that 500 plus page book, what I have done is Krantivir Bhagat Singh is Satya Bhagat's small tract on Bhagat Singh. So I have reproduced that. Abhyudaya issue of 8th May 1931, after the execution of Bhagat Singh, that was banned. So I took that banned issue in that. And for Bhavishya, it is very interesting that in Aligarh, in one of freedom fighters' son, sometime he read in Hindi paper Jagran about my interest in all these things. And he, sent some message or, then I met him in Aligarh. I was going to Aligarh Muslim University for some work. So I went to him. He said, I want to show you something. Now, what he showed me, that in Lal, जिसमें बही बांध के रखते हैं, तो बही में उसने 6 महीने की कम से कम जो है वो भविष्य की फाइलें बांध के रखी थी. Now that his father was actually subscriber. Now he offered, actually I wanted I should get it photocopied on my own. No, he got it photocopied on his own and didn't allow me to, photocopy it on my own expense. And then those 6 months issues, I put into that because I tried other issues of Bhavishya in Allahabad University, in Hindi Sahitya Sammelan, so many places. I couldn't get Bhavishya's file. And Ravnak Singh Sehgal was not only bringing out Bhavishya, he was bringing out Chand also. Later on, he actually brought out Karam Bhumi also. As you were telling about his social concerns, actually Chand has the real, Achut Ank, not only Phansi Ank, Achut Ank, and his wife was also a college teacher, and he was for all social reforms. So he was bringing out for women's education, he was bringing out issues like that. So that way, this generation of people, have been contributing towards not only creating national consciousness, rather social consciousness as well. Social reform also, equality of men and women, etc. And particularly in Hindi journals and in areas like UP, etc. So that was a great radical kind of thing. I think.
Professor Chamanlal, some copies of Bhavishya are available on archive.org. So if you want to check, you can check.
Okay.
I was going to say this because we have scanned that and uploaded on archive.org. 5 bundles of Bhavish are available because we got them scanned. It's absolutely wonderful, worth looking at. Everyone. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, so you people got those scanned and put?
Yes.
Okay.
It is
On
on our
archive.
page,
Oh, I
CSBS
see.
page.
Oh my, hey, that's great. Any other questions from the floor? Then in that case, can I just thank the wonderful speakers here today and close this particular panel? And
Thanks, Anindita, for being such a wonderful chair.
thank you all for giving me so much to think about. It has been such a wonderful session. Thank you very much, all of you. Professor Chamanlal, you, of course, Charu, and you, of course, Aparna. Okay, bye. Bye, everybody, for the next moment.
Thank you. Thank you.